Public hearing of the Foreign Affairs and Aid Subcommittee of the Joint Standing Committee on Foreign Affairs, Defence and Trade for the inquiry into the role of Australia's international development program in preventing conflict. I would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land in which each of us is joining today, and I would like to pay my respects to elders past and present. I also acknowledge the cultures of any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples present with us here today. This hearing will be broadcast on the Parliament's website, and the proof and official transcripts of the proceedings will be published on the committee's webpage. I now welcome representatives from the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade to give evidence today. For the Hansard record, could you please state your name and the capacity in which you are appearing here today?
Look, thanks, Chair, and thanks for inviting us to make a submission. Jamie Spisk, I'm the Deputy Secretary of the Development Multilateral and Europe Group within DFAT, and I've got a range of colleagues here from me who are responsible for different parts of our regional and implementation of development program. And if it's okay with you, I'll maybe let them introduce themselves. Please, as they. Well, let's do it now, and then Mark, do you want to?
Thanks, Jamie. Morning, everyone. Mark Tattersall, First Assistant Secretary for Polynesia, Micronesia and Development Division in the Office of the Pacific.
Morning, everyone. Pablo Kung. I'm the First Assistant Secretary for the Southeast Asia Regional and Mainland Division.
Good morning. Sarah Story, First Assistant Secretary, South and Central Asia Division.
Steve Scott, First Assistant Secretary, Humanitarian and Civil Society Division.
Sarah De Zooten, First Assistant Secretary, Defence and National Security Policy Division.
This hearing is a legal proceeding of the Parliament, and the giving of false or misleading evidence is a serious matter and may be regarded as a contempt of Parliament. The evidence given today will be recorded by Hansard and attracts parliamentary privilege. I now invite you, if you would like, to make an opening statement before we proceed to discussion with committee members.
Look, thanks, Chair. And as I said, we've provided our written submission. I might just sort of give a few sort of opening comments and then obviously open up for any questions people may have. I think, the importance of this submission, I think, is obviously we've got a world that is under very significant change. The current Middle East conflict highlights the costs that conflict has on societies and economies. We know that's the greatest factor that undermines economic development, trade and country security. We're also facing an increasingly challenging global environment as we see the Russian invasion of Ukraine and, as mentioned, the current impact the Middle East conflicts having not just in the Middle East but obviously globally, including here in Australia. We're facing an environment with greater strategic competition, which is intensifying inter- and interstate conflicts. We're also dealing with the increasing impacts of climate change, which is driving greater displacement and humanitarian needs, including in our region, where Pacific Island countries would see climate change as the greatest security threat. Preventing conflict, particularly in our region, is central to Australia's own economic prosperity and security. When conflict occurs, as mentioned, it drives displacement. We've currently got almost 120 million people who are forcibly displaced, and we've got the largest refugee camp in the world in our region, Cox's Bazar, with 1.2 million people. If you take IMF estimates, they assess that $1 invested in preventative measures to conflict, including such as development efforts, can save between $26 and $100 in future conflict-related crises. We know in our region the costs of conflict, the Ramsey intervention in Solomon Islands cost the Australian government at that time well over $3 billion. And over the 4 years of the conflict, GDP dropped by 24%. We know that the conflict in Bougainville had generational impacts on communities in not just Bougainville and Papua New Guinea, and with the closure of the mine, it closed 16% of the government, PNG's government revenue. We also know that the ongoing sort of conflicts in the highlands in Papua New Guinea has a direct impact on the communities in those regions, but most particularly women and girls. And we know when conflict occurs that women and girls are most heavily impacted by crises. In humanitarian crises, women are 14 times more likely to be impacted or victims of sexual and gender-based violence. I think the key thing, obviously, in our submission is highlighting how the important role Australia's development assistance has in investing in preventing conflict. It's never alone going to deliver that, but it has a key role in that. So well-targeted development assistance can help prevent conflict, particularly in terms of how it reduces inequality and particularly how it gives opportunities and jobs. Over the last recent years, the government's looked increasingly how we better align our development program to countries in our region and also investment in regionalism. And colleagues can talk more about some of that work. I think one of the key things is with the development of our country development partnership plans, it's about how the development program aligns most effectively with countries' own needs. But it's also a lever for how we have conversations with countries to use that as a multiplying effect, both to deliver broader economic benefits, but also our collective security. We've used our development program in partnership with other tools to sort of ensure that we can maintain banking services in the Pacific, include digital connectivity. As I think mentioned in our submission, by the end of last year, every Pacific Island country had some undersea cable connectivity, which is critical for their ongoing inclusion and ability to be part of a global economy and access to health and education services. We've used, in partnership with the development program, the investment with Telstra to purchase Digicel, the largest mobile phone company in the Pacific. We've used new tools as well through our Labour Mobility and Palm program that delivers almost $500 million in remittances from Timor-Leste and the Pacific Island countries back to communities. But as mentioned, one of the key things I think we've used the development program is how we have more honest conversations with countries about how we need to invest and have assurances around our collective security. Some of the investments, as I've mentioned, that we've made in our region, the recent stepping up, including on climate financing, some of our sports diplomacy work, have all been key elements to how we've had the conversations to secure the Fallapili Agreement with Tuvalu, the recent PNG Puk Treaty, Defence Treaty, and obviously discussions with Indonesia around the Indonesian Defence Treaty. There's broader issues in the multilateral system about how we invest in conflict. One that I'd flag is obviously Australia's leadership at the end of last year at UNGA, where we led an effort to highlight and work to shine a light and prevent the attacks on humanitarian workers. 2024, 2025 were the two years where the greatest number of humanitarian workers were killed since the Second World War. And with other countries, we've managed to get over 110 countries to sign on to that declaration, and how we now implement that declaration to prevent the attacks, particularly on local workers in countries like in Myanmar, in Sudan, in the Middle East. Chair, I'll stop there, and obviously very happy to take questions, and my colleagues can talk more specifically to some of the ways the development program is responding to conflict prevention in the region.
Well, thank you, and thank you for your submission, and thank you also for the senior level attendance at this hearing. It is a reflection of the seriousness that DFAT accords to this issue, so thank you on behalf of the committee. Regrettably, the Hansard for our previous hearing isn't online yet, but a theme of the previous hearing, where we met with academics and aid and delivery organisations, was essentially a recognition of the deep expertise that DFAT has in conflict prevention, the deep expertise in particular conflict exposed or conflict at risk environments that we operate in, but also a view that much of that expertise and knowledge is implicit. It exists with individuals at either post or maybe at RGKC, and that it's not made explicit in an explicitly articulated conflict prevention framework, and there's not an explicit institutional architecture for sharing and coordinating conflict prevention efforts. Would you be able to describe how those coordination efforts happen across the functions in DFAT and then across government between DFAT, Defence, AFP, other organisations operating in these areas? And maybe respond to that view that there needs to be an explicit articulation of the way we go about conflict prevention.
Yeah, look, thanks, Chair. I'll make a couple of overarching comments on it, and others may want to add to it. But I think one of the, and Sarah might, particularly in terms of some of the work that's been done in our region. But in the past, we did have a conflict fragility section that sat within at times Steve's area, and I think that was an area where it was looking at how we looked at a much more sort of centralised approach to conflict prevention, and including having people with levels of expertise sort of on it. I think, to be frank, over the last 5 years, we've realised increasingly that the best way that we can address a conflict is having it most directly embedded into the bilateral and regional partnerships and dialogues that we have. So in terms of our region, understanding what are the early warning systems or issues where we might be seeing the risks of conflict, and then how we're using our foreign policy development and whole of government efforts to best address those. So obviously, particularly in Papua New Guinea, I mean, we have a very big post. In Solomon Islands, we have a big post, and across Pacific, where we bring the whole of government equities together. And though there's a need, often we'll use interdepartmental committees to ensure that we're delivering joined up effort on that. How we're actually best using the different tools is most effectively done by those resources and representatives in country in discussions with counterparts on addressing those. In terms of the multilateral system, it's obviously broad. There's lots of different elements in terms of the Peace Building Commission, the UN Security Council, UNGA, and so our multilateral division absolutely does have a role in terms of coordinating how we're thinking about our efforts in the multilateral system and conflict prevention. And there's certainly expertise that we have in that, both in our New York and Geneva posts, but also back here in Canberra. And the final element I'll touch on is obviously how we've looked at embedding the conflict prevention element more regionally, what we're doing through the Pacific Island Forum, what we're doing through ASEAN and through regional bodies. We've obviously, if people recall, the PIF agreed to the Boy Security Declaration back in 2018-19 in the PIF, which provided sort of a platform for how the region was going to look at and address the risk, our collective security and potential conflicts of that. So I think leaning more into that regional element has been one of the key focuses over the last, particularly over the last 5+ years. But Sarah, do you want to add any more, particularly on the sort of conflict prevention?
As Jamie alluded to, we've fairly recently created the Conflict Prevention and Strategy branch, which sits within my division. That is not intended to take over from the conflict prevention work, which is embedded, because, as Jamie said, for us, conflict prevention and peace building is core business of the entire work of the department. It's a core element of diplomacy since history began, and it's also, of course, a central element of the development program. So it is absolutely embedded across and close to those country and regional teams and development teams which are most associated with the tensions and the root cause issues that are relevant to their geographic responsibility. But this branch is intended to support and engage across the system with a particular focus on reducing and deterring the risk around interstate conflict. Now, that is including between great powers. So, of course, National Defence Strategy has articulated quite clearly that we are now within a 10-year warning window, that 10-year warning window has been lost. And what does that mean for how our department supports the government's agenda around secure, peace and prosperous region? So we are very focused on those connections between the Department of Defence in particular, in how we work together to maintain peace in the region, and how we collaborate, if you like, as arms of the levers of statecraft that the government has open to it to maintain peace. Mm-hmm. So that's the role of this branch, but we work incredibly closely with other parts of the enterprise and organisation, which are either working through ASEAN or Pacific Island Forum, or indeed country or regional programs, as we all work towards maintaining peace.
And in that coordination between agencies, I mean, is there a documented, agreed position across government of how we think about conflict prevention? I mean, is our approach to conflict prevention both consistent and agreed across Defence, AFP, DFAT? I suppose what I'm saying is that there's that view that put to us in the previous hearing that, you know, strategy doesn't exist unless it's written down. Is this something that we are dealing with on an iterative basis, on an ad hoc basis, or do we have an agreed strategy that everyone has bought into across government?
Well, I'll touch in terms of some of the development stuff, and then if you want to talk a bit in terms of the broader foreign policy elements of it, Sarah. But yeah, the government launched international development policy does have conflict prevention as a key element of the policy. It flags, it highlights that. Obviously, as I mentioned, that we know that conflict is the biggest underminer of countries' economic and security and national security. The government also launched, I think, a year and a half, almost 2 years ago, the new humanitarian policy. Again, the humanitarian policy highlights as a central part of it the importance of how we use our humanitarian program to both invest in disaster risk reduction, both due to climate impacts, but also conflict impacts. It talks about the work we do about our protracted funding, how we provide multi-year funding that best addresses situations we're currently facing in Syria, Lebanon, Myanmar. And so embedded very much in those policies is how conflict prevention is a central element of how we think about our programming, selection of partners and dialogues with countries. And that's something which obviously drives our coordination, not just across DFAT, but with the NGO sector, with UN agencies and with other government departments that we work with, including with the AFP and the ADF, particularly in the Pacific region. But Sarah, anything you want?
Yeah, sure. I mean, there are a range of strategies, as you'd imagine, which exist in terms of how we take forward our foreign policy objectives. Conflict prevention is a central part of all of those because, of course, that's the ultimate objective is preserving peace and stability and prosperity in the region. So for us, I would see there are a range of strategies that we have which convey the effect that we would like to have in our region, which is, of course, around stable, peace and prosperous region. Conflict prevention is a key element of those strategies. And to your point about how do we work with other agencies, the very standing up of this division is an element of that deeper integration with us and National Intelligence Community, Department of Defence, so that not a day would go past where I'm not talking to colleagues in the Department of Defence. So we work hand in glove as we take forward these objectives.
Okay. I'll pass to Ms Collins for questions after one further question on this. I just wanted to give you an opportunity to respond to, I think it was Ms Templeman put a question on notice about the RIMA report. Yeah. And we've sort of understood the context of that. It was a pre-COVID report that didn't sort of come to completion. The world's changed a lot in that time. But some of the sort of interim recommendations from that evaluation that was shared with this committee align with those assessments about the need for coordination and explicit strategy. I think the evaluation says, quote, elevating conflict prevention and peace building as a central element in Australian foreign policy requires a high-level mandate, ideally across agencies. Regular and ongoing interagency cooperation and funding arrangements support coherent approaches and enable shared prevention-focused analysis and planning. So can I take it from the evidence before us that DFAT's view is that recommendation has been addressed by the new structures and new processes that have been put in place since then? Yeah,
no, I mean, I would definitely say that. I mean, I think if the argument is, and I don't think it is from Susan Harris-Rimmer's recommendation, that it's about sort of establishing a separate conflict prevention policy that overarching drives on it. But if it was, I don't think that's something which we would see as the way we've taken our approach on it and the most effective way to respond to it. I think what the recommendation was getting at is a more concerted, proactive approach to how we think about conflict prevention is driving across the way that we think about our foreign policy, bilateral, regional partnerships and how we utilise the development program most effectively. And I think that's absolutely what then led to the development and the focus on the new international development policy, the new humanitarian policy, and the establishment of the elevation of the work in conflict prevention in Sarah's team's area as well. The only thing I'd sort of mention on this as well, that, you know, some of this we can't go into as publicly, but to reassure that there is very regularly, when we're tracking early warning or emerging risks on potential conflicts, we do have and work closely with O&I that facilitates scenario planning across government around how we are assessing the potential future risks of issues, how we then try and ensure that we are responding to those. What does it mean for different levers of our efforts? You know, we know we've got the PNG election in mid-2027. We've got the current challenges around Bougainville, the Bougainville discussions on independence and all of these potential being triggers, and they all very much inform pretty regular scenario planning that occurs across government that brings Defence, DFAT, AFP, Attorney Generals and other parties together on that. And then informs how, through our development partnership programs, not only how we use a development program, but some of how we want to work with government, the PNG government or the Solomons government or whatever, how to try and support them to mitigate, prevent the risks of those conflicts emerging.
Wonderful. Ms Collins, or Senator Collins.
Thank you so much, Chair. Real pleasure to be here listening to your testimony this morning. I've done a lot of work in this area, and you know, I'm a big believer in our development program, but something, and it builds on these questions really, but I'd just love to help you square the circle on the fact that our, you know, the development indicators in Papua New Guinea, Solomon Islands, you know, they're all going backwards. The risks are getting greater. Conflict is increasing, especially for women at the very, very local level. I've heard you talk about, you know, strategy today. It sounds very regional, top level. You know, I was helping the US government with their Global Fragility Act in Papua New Guinea. They're trying to turn that conflict prevention upside down, do things very radically different. I don't know how effective that was in Papua New Guinea because they only had $7 million to spend over 10 years or something. But are we now at a point where, you know, after decades of investment and so many billions of dollars that we've invested into somewhere like Papua New Guinea, and we seem to be going backwards, that we have to start thinking differently about the strategy that we have there? Or that, you know, you just set up a conflict strategy branch. Does that have to now be front and centre of the development program that we have? Like, are these the sorts of conversations that you're having?
Yeah. Well, I mean, so first of all, I mean, I think to acknowledge that the situation in Papua New Guinea and Melanesia, one might argue, sort of more broadly, continues to face real issues, most particularly, as you said, in terms of, you know, the development indicators, the achievements of the Sustainable Development Goals, and without doubt, some of the indicators in relation to the attacks, security, marginalisation of women and girls is, you know, continues to be. Whether you argue it's going backwards, it remains a terrible impact on those concerned, but the economies and communities in Melanesia, and then in terms of our engagement with it. I mean, so yes, we always need to continue to re-look at this. We need to think about, and as I said, mentioned, we've got, you know, some very big, you know, events coming forward in the next 12 months in PNG with the elections and Bougainville, and we need to continue to look at how we're best addressing that. One thing I would say, though, is that it's always, I think, easy to look at what needs to be done more on and what is going backwards. Or two things I would say, just take on the PNG example, is one of them, it's always hard to sort of identify what hasn't occurred or what could have occurred otherwise, and remembering that, you know, last year was 50 years since independence. Papua New Guinea, it's still a relatively new country. It's bringing together, you know, over 800 different tribal groups, and actually that there's a nation that is still struggling with issues, but together, yes, there's conflict in in different parts of Papua New Guinea, but it's a country that is growing, that is holding together, is something that we can't sort of forget within that, and not try and at least celebrate some of those achievements. I think also, even on the economy side, there's unequal economic growth, but to be honest, some of the benefits that PNG is getting from its resources is significantly higher than it was a decade ago. The recent IMF program has been actually critical in terms of addressing some of the challenges, economic fiscal challenges that PNG faces. So I'd just simply sort of say that it's why it's our largest development program. I'd argue that our development program has been key to trying to prevent conflict, provide economic opportunities. To be honest, without some of the work on the banking efforts on aviation and that, probably PNG wouldn't have the connectivity it would have now. Without the investment in Digicel, I think you wouldn't have communities across the Pacific having access to financial services. So I'm not in any way dismissing the negative indicators and challenges, but it's probably also highlighting that without that, what the scenario might look like could potentially be significantly worse.
Can I ask a quick follow-up question, please? Just on the, I guess the local level, all of that, and you raised mining, you raised women. A lot of the conflict, as you say, happens at the very, very local level. So, I guess one of the things that constantly comes up is a recommendation for our aid and development program to be more locally focused, be more flexible in the way that we can provide that aid. Something that I have advocated for a long, long time is for, it's very specific, but safe houses for women right across Papua New Guinea. We talk about conflict prevention. That's very, very difficult to do when you've got long-running economic inequality across the highlands, for example. But we could be providing conflict protection. And there are these huge gaps. Same with the mining communities. That's where a lot of the conflict happens, when the mining goes. So do we have strategies around that, about being more local about our conflict prevention and protection?
I might ask Mark if you want to sort of comment or add anything in terms of both PNG but the Pacific more broadly on the conflict side.
Thanks, Jamie, and thanks, Senator, for your interest and acknowledge your work and background in this space as well. I mean, I was struck, from our own submission, you look at the list of countries at risk of institutional and social fragility, and it's just a sprinkling of Pacific nations, right, including those in Melanesia, Solomons and PNG, and that's obviously right on our doorstep. What I would say is, I think governments of both persuasions have recognised the scale of that challenge, and we are changing the way we engage with the region. There was the Pacific Step Up under the previous government, and now a cabinet-agreed Pacific strategy that addresses the challenges of the region in a fundamentally whole-of-government way, and that brings together our development investments, which are long-standing, with new ways of working across the defence and security space, greater levels of coordination with defence and AFP, investments in transnational crime, which is such a growing threat for the region. So I think we are thinking about new ways of working, and we are entering transformational arrangements with a range of countries, as you're aware. So I think we are doing things differently. Does the region continue to face challenges? Quite obviously, but we're working in a local way to address those challenges where there are particular examples of conflict. And you mentioned PNG and the Highlands. It's obviously a huge focus for our team in Port Moresby and beyond to address those issues in a local way. You mentioned the idea of shelters. We do invest in shelters across PNG. We could do more, obviously. So we're happy to look at that. As Jamie mentioned, our broader international development policy actually has a very strong focus on locally led development, and each of our investments, as well as our country-level strategies, we are required to assess whether we're adequately using local-led delivery mechanisms, and we have to balance that in all contexts. A country that's already as decentralised and fragmented as Papua New Guinea, we do want to make substantial investments in the centre and the government, but we need to address local challenges as well. That's really the structural challenge we face, but we're happy to have further discussions about how we might adapt and address those emerging challenges in where you're interested.
Thank you. Those safe houses are really, really important. Last I checked, and it was a couple of years ago, but there are only about 7 of them, and most of them based in Port Moresby. But they can have such a massive effect for, there's one that's actually a warehouse up in the Highlands. It's got hundreds of women. They're building, they're making the bags, selling them, economic development, bringing jobs and opportunities to these women. It's changing their lives. It's amazing. So just advocate for that. Thank you.
Certainly visited that one up in the Highlands. I'm very proud to see it being run by a Victoria University alumni from my electorate in Melbourne's West. Ms Templeman.
Thank you. Thanks again for being with us. I know more than I did when we last had an opportunity to speak, because I spent a week in PNG, courtesy of the Gates Foundation with the Save the Children program. So that was a terrific education to see the work on the ground, to talk to your colleagues there who are clearly putting their heart and soul into the work that they do and the transformation it can make, and recognising the scale of the challenges there. So there are 2 things I was interested to get your thinking on, and that is how the real commitment to local partnerships assists with conflict prevention in the programs that you do. We obviously looked primarily at health and education, but also at some of the hydropower, so a range of projects. But the local partnerships came through as a very strong theme. So just how that fits with conflict prevention, and how that builds resilience around that. And the second one is around the gender, why the focus on women and children supports conflict prevention. Yeah. And it doesn't have to, my experience was PNG, but I'm happy for it to be, take it more broadly.
Well, maybe I'll make a few comments, and I might invite Sarah and then Pablo Mark, if they want to talk any specific elements of the localisation and the gender issue in terms of the programs we've got. But 2 things. First of all, just thanks for visiting PNG and the delegation. I think we might have said at the private hearing that we think it's really critical that parliamentarians visit the region, both because it sends a really important message to those countries that Australian parliamentarians are interested in the challenges, the stories, and the perspectives. As you said, hopefully it gives you then a perspective and understanding of how Australia is responding, both good and bad, and what we can do better. So I think that's helpful. The localisation issue, I think, is absolutely central on this. It's partly this point that, when we look at conflict prevention, it needs to be looking at the great powers competition and what that means in terms of our foreign policy, and it needs to be very much at that sort of bottom-up sort of elements of that. And that's why I think, this sort of, we believe that it's not sort of a one policy sort of approach on this. It needs to really be thinking at the different levels. I think the localisation is flagged as an embedded part of, if you look at the development policy, humanitarian policy, it's very much a central part of that, and a much stronger part than it was before. I'll be honest enough to say we've still got to do better at it. It's not easy, because localisation comes with less control, greater risk, and at times less coherence, because you're having to trust and invest in local priorities and efforts, and that may not always necessarily be driven from the Australian centre. Having said that, I think in PNG, actually, some of the examples I think have really worked well on this, and it has been the Church Partnership Program. It's been going now for well over 20 years. 80% of health services, 50% of education services in PNG are provided by church-based agencies, not the government. And so part of that was, how do we harness relationships between and empower those local education and health facilities and centres to be able to get the resources and better make decisions on that. And I think that program has demonstrated that it's been an effective way going forward. I think there's still more we can do, particularly how we make linkages back with Australian providers and more strong Australian Pacific or Australian PNG connections in these areas. The other one I think is in Steve's area on the Australian Humanitarian Partnership Program, where it's investment in Red Cross, local organisations around their own disaster preparedness, their own early warning systems. Still a way to go and challenges, but that's been another program which I think we're looking at how do we further enhance and strengthen that, and the government announced a just under $100 million investment over 8 years?
10 years.
10 years.
For that, and same amount for Red Cross Partnership.
Yeah, for the Red Cross Partnership. Just on gender equality, I'll be honest, it's a real challenge in Melanesia. The number of parliamentarians, the number of women involved in the formal parts of the democratic process is very low. It's an issue which our new ambassador for gender equality, Michelle O'Byrne, is very focused on. That she's travelling up to PNG soon. She's visited Fiji and thinking how do we look at different creative ways of ensuring there's greater participation, not just in the formal parliamentarian, but through other parts, whether it's in media, whether it's in civil society, whether it's other roles that allow that voice perspective to be heard. But without that, then unfortunately the decisions and when it comes to budgets, finances, too often exclude the very real perspectives of women and girls who are often, as we've said, the greatest victims of conflict. But maybe just ask other colleagues who want to add anything just in terms of that, your broader points of localisation, gender and other parts of the region. Sarah, did you want to?
Sure, thanks. Ms Templeman, thanks for your interest and thanks for the committee's interest in this really important topic. I would just try to combine a couple of things. Just you've mentioned, for instance, the very high level. Yes, we have those strategies and policies, as Ms de Zouten has pointed out. Then we look at the regional. So for my region, South and Central Asia, it's the most conflict-affected region, sub-region of the Indo-Pacific. And then we go down to the country and we look at very localised factors. So if I look at the factors that are driving instability in some of the countries in my area of responsibility, for instance, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka and Nepal have all seen governments overthrown by populist youth-driven movements. And what is driving that disaffection among the youth population are a lack of opportunities and skills. So the World Bank, for instance, has estimated that in South Asia, 18 to 20 million young people come into working age every year, but only a third to a half of them are going to actually find jobs. And the statistics for women and their participation in the labour force is even less. So that's why we partner with local governments, but also at a much more localised level as well. So taking that localisation principle further, for instance, in Bangladesh, we partner with BRAC, I think it is in fact the world's largest NGO, and we deliver very localised programs around training and workforce participation, and some of these have a particular focus on women and girls. So we're always assessing what are the drivers for instability, they may be non-state actors as well as these social and economic factors, and how do we address these? So we do them by, in my area, I'll just give a really rough list. We try through our very modest development program in this part of the world to boost inclusive economic growth through skills development programs. We build skills of future leaders, such as through the Australia Awards program. As Mr Isbister has noted, we really focus on boosting the connectivity. South Asia is the Indo-Pacific's least connected region. We try to focus on programs that foster unity, social cohesion and reconciliation after conflict, for instance, in Sri Lanka. We support substantial governance programs, say in Nepal and Bangladesh, around the conduct of local recent elections, returning both to democratic governance. And we support regional cooperation through boosting some of that regional architecture. So they're just some heads of much deeper engagement that give you a sense of the complexity of that effort.
Pablo, did you want?
Yeah,
thanks.
sure. Good morning, committee members. So my patch covers our relations with ASEAN and also bilateral relationships with Thailand, Vietnam, Laos, Myanmar and Cambodia. I guess it's fair to say in my countries, or the countries that I have responsibility for, unlike with this story, there's not much prospect of popular overthrow of governments. But I think I just wanted to make a couple of points, and it's a bit of a grab bag just because of the nature of what I cover. But obviously there's been reference to Myanmar, both in terms of our submissions and some of the comments made here today. I mean, clearly conflict mitigation is our fundamental first objective of our development program in Myanmar. I use the word conflict, or the words conflict mitigation, because I think obviously the horse is bolted on conflict prevention. But under that objective, we are funding a range of organisations, both in country and across Southeast Asia more broadly, to support, where we can, inclusive dialogue to reduce tensions and to promote peace-building efforts. Very much as part of this, we try to ensure that women and other marginalised groups are playing a role in these processes, and a big focus of our development cooperation program with Myanmar is around gender equality and reducing gender-based violence. On gender equality, Cambodia, I think, is a good example. We've been working in Cambodia for decades, really, on helping them to address, obviously, the very serious problem that we also have around gender-based violence. I note, Senator, your comment about safe houses in Papua New Guinea. We support a range of safe houses in Cambodia for victims of gender-based violence, to provide them with shelter to them and their children, and also help them with access to justice for ongoing court processes. So that's a very important part of that program in Cambodia. Just on ASEAN as a whole, because I know a lot of our discussion today has been either high-level strategy or sort of locally led projects, and I just wanted to emphasise also the role of declaratory statements, also the role that we across government play in negotiating those. Of course, ASEAN specialises in a lot of these statements, but we do have a strong view that over time it can lead to changes in government behaviour and government-to-government behaviour. And just in the context of conflict prevention, noting that in October last year, at the ASEAN-Australia Summit in Kuala Lumpur, our Prime Minister and the leaders of ASEAN agreed on a leader statement on conflict prevention. And over time, so that basically talks about the role that us and ASEAN can play in terms of having our own agency to prevent conflict in the region. Obviously, there's a couple of examples already of, I guess, intra-ASEAN conflict, or in the case of Thailand and Cambodia, currently stalled conflict, which could reignite at any time. And then, of course, broader issues, for example, around the South China Sea, where obviously it's in all our interests to work very hard on conflict prevention. So that has been adopted, and we're sort of looking to see how we can roll that out in our development programs. It's also the 50th anniversary this year of ASEAN's Treaty of Amity and Cooperation. So we're looking as we support the Philippines as chair of ASEAN this year, to see how we can build on what we've done in the declaratory sense on conflict prevention into more concrete programs.
I'm conscious we have 15 minutes left. Can I ask, you have to exit?
Just very, very briefly, I was very, very interested in one of the comments in the submission about the use of diaspora groups, and then your comments, Mr. Kang, just about what we might do out of country, and I'm just keen to understand how well developed is that as a strategy, and just using Ms. Story's, can you point to some specific initiatives that are working well in terms of how we might be using diaspora groups to facilitate greater cooperation, understanding, conflict resolution in an effort to, when some of our neighbours do hopefully get to a position of sort of domestic calmness or lack of conflict, that these external elements can be a positive contribution to peace.
So just in relation to Myanmar, all I would say there is it's, as you would appreciate, Senator, it's quite a different way that we do our development cooperation program. Normally we would agree sort of with the other government the shared priorities and then sort of have a development partnership plan that we both sign off on. Obviously we do have that plan in relation to Myanmar, but we don't engage the regime on that. So I think in terms of working with diaspora groups, it's probably a much more of a focus for us than it would necessarily be in other bilateral development programs that we have. As you know, we work very closely with implementing partners on the ground in Myanmar, and that's a combination of local groups, international NGOs, multilateral organisations, but of course because of the sensitivities around revealing who we support and the potential risks that involves, we don't tend to go into that. But we do very much as part of our development cooperation program, and when we're putting it together, consult very widely, including with those diaspora groups, given the nature of how we deliver development assistance.
One more, if I might, Chair, just turning to the matter of agility. So how agile is our thinking and how agile is our responsiveness, given that things are now changing very, very quickly? So the ability to stay aware of those factors influencing change and then responding to changing circumstances.
I'll make one comment, then maybe Steve, if you want to add in some of the stuff on the humanitarian side on this. I just say that I think one of the drivers around the development partnership plans was actually having a live document which we had with countries that informed how we were utilising our development program partnerships with countries, and that being able to shift and realign where need be in response to crises. And I think we're now a year and a half into many of those, and they're in terms of their reviews now of what's worked on those and what hasn't. The environment at the moment is probably challenging us more than ever before in being responsive and flexible, both because of how quickly the region's changing, the amount of ODA cuts we're facing in the region, and the need for us to think about how we align in that. And that's required us to make some very hard decisions about good programs we previously funded are no longer good enough reasons for us to continue to fund them, because there's other programs that need are more critical for meeting both development needs, contributing to prevention of conflict, and our own bilateral interests. And so, you'll see with some of the ways we've engaged with countries on the use of development program on new bilateral partnerships has really been, I think, quite flexible in how we realign those efforts. But I'll be honest with you, Senator, we can do better on this. The challenges with governments in bureaucracies, you establish systems for good reasons. Trying to evolve those systems, whether they're through funding mechanisms, contracts, and that, pivoting them is not always is easy in theory, but in practice has its challenges. So we've got a way to go with it, I think, on how we're responding to climate needs and climate financing in the Pacific. We've got think differently. Two big drivers, I think, beyond the sort of geostrategic issue is the potential changes of technology, access to artificial intelligence and digital connectivity, what that's offered in terms of fintech options and solutions in the Pacific in ways we didn't have 3 years ago, how we can potentially use AI to help with access to education, health, telehealth and other things is things which I think we need to sort of look at. But
we're going to have bells ringing in 5 minutes. Can I just offer Mr. Gosling, Ms. Jarrett, Mr. Zapier, if you want to set your questions on collectively, and we can get a joint response.
I think it's for Mark, but maybe someone else. I've noticed that the Papua New Guinea government is trying to do gun buyback and trying to get less weapons up in different areas to prevent, tribal warfare or whatever. So seems like a sensible idea on the face of it. Are we providing assistance to that program, or is that something they're just doing independently?
I'll need to take that specifically on notice. I don't know whether we're providing direct support to that initiative, but we are engaged very substantively in anti-conflict and conflict prevention efforts across PNG, and particularly in the Highlands, where we have specific programs that are working to both anticipate and respond to conflict, and the prevalence of high-powered weapons is obviously a huge concern in that regard, and it's a growing challenge for the country. So I think fundamentally we're committed to working with the government to address it. I don't know whether we're directly supporting that initiative, though. I'll need to get back to you.
I know the AFP is pretty engaged on it. I know, if you recall, the Solomons and Bougainville conflicts gun amnesty programs were a key part of that, and the government was heavily involved in looking at how they worked with governments to reduce access to small arms. So, as you've seen, it's a huge issue, and as I said, we'll come back to you on the more details of it. But I know the AFP and ADF are pretty heavily involved in looking at some of those.
It seems like a very practical and direct way to assist the conflict prevention efforts. Thanks.
One thing, thank you first of all for being here. One thing we haven't talked about today is the potential role of the private sector in this space, and whether that be through how do we improve public-private partnerships, or even just tap private sector-led initiatives that can support what we're trying to achieve. You know, they have local people on the ground, they've got expertise, they've got capabilities, they've got philanthropic intent, etc. So I'm just wondering, can we better activate that? Is it part of our overall strategy? And maybe it's a question I notice, given it's a big question, Chair, but yeah. Or a quick comment to...
I'll make a quick comment, just say, is that it is part of the strategy. I'd say that there are elements that we are doing it, certainly more so than the past. I mentioned the issues around banking, the digital connectivity, how private sector is definitely a driver on that. The other part of it, I think, is how we're using infrastructure. We've still got a way to go on this, but our frustration that some of the large infrastructure programs in the Pacific have not been harnessing local businesses and job opportunities that come with that, and that being a driver for, as flagged earlier, the risks of job opportunities and that, or lack of them, being a driver of conflict. Philanthropics, we can do better. It's easier said than done. They're very specific in what they often want to do, but I think there is a space where we've got to look at ways of having dialogues to bring philanthropics more effectively into some of the work across the Indo-Pacific.
Yeah, and I'm talking the philanthropic programs of the big multinationals and people who've got the money and the capability in those markets.
Yeah. And one practical example we have already is Power On. It's a partnership with the power companies here who, their linesmen, we send them out to rebuild the power networks after cyclones and tsunamis and things in the Pacific, and they love doing it.
And actually quite a few of them are from the diaspora. Tongans, Samoans who work for the power utilities here, then go back often.
Thank you, and I'll be very brief. A number of the Christian churches provide very localised humanitarian programs in a number of those countries. My simple question is this: are they helpful or are they a hindrance?
Both. No, I mean, honestly, it's this point about localisation, centralisation. They're absolutely critical because the localisation the role churches can play is really important. The Can Do network we fund, the Church Agency Network, is one of the key partners under the Australian Humanitarian Partnership. But they're also, very decentralised, can be very messy, can be hard to coordinate, and so it's also a challenge. But that's not a reason not to work with them. It's just the need for us to continue to keep that dialogue going.
Just finally, if Hansard can pick this up. Look, I want to recognise the extraordinary work that DFAT has done in driving the launch of the Declaration for the Protection of Humanitarian Personnel, now joined by more than 100 countries. Obviously, it's designed to incentivise countries to make pledges for concrete measures to keep humanitarian personnel safe, enable them to do their work in conflict and disaster zones. Can I ask that, consistent with that, in the last term of government, the Joint Standing Committee of Foreign Affairs, Defence and Trade, this committee, completed an inquiry into the review of the operation of the amendments made by the Autonomous Sanctions Amendment, Magnitsky Style and other Thematic Sanctions Act, and recommended that the Australian Government, in consultation with the humanitarian sector, amends the Autonomous Sanctions Act to provide a standing exemption from all sanctions measures for legitimate humanitarian assistance, consistent with the approach taken by UN Security Council Resolution 2664. We've heard from many humanitarian groups before this inquiry that the protections afforded to them as Australians are different to the protections afforded to them by US, Canadian, UK legal regimes. Perhaps given the context, it's best to take on notice, but can I reiterate the committee's ongoing interest in the progressing of this matter, and if you can provide a further update on what's being done to respond to this recommendation to implement sanctions exemptions for legitimate humanitarian assistance, that would assist the committee.
I can assure you it's being focused on Steve's area with legal or engagement, and we'll come back to you on it.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you for your attendance. I now declare this meeting closed. Colleagues, if you have questions on notice, if you can provide them by Monday, we'll assure that they will get answered. Do I need any other formalities for that? Very good.